Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Today is November 8th for a special Board of County Commissioners meeting. Commissioner Sandelli has other duties this morning at the canvassing board at the elections office, so he's not going to be joining us. If we could please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Please be seated. Okay, if we could open the meeting up. Roger, you want to open the meeting up with your comments about the agenda items today?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The purpose of this meeting this morning was to conduct a public hearing to adopt an ordinance amending the an amendment to the LDC and building regulations. And I'm going to ask Mark Mora to take us through that quick conversation, but also there is a change this morning based on an email we received from Floodplain Management Office in Tallahassee. It's a division of emergency management that that will cause us to ask you for a delay in the decisions to be made today. Mark.
Good morning, Commissioners. I believe Richard Wesch would like to start with a procedural piece of this agenda.
Mr. Chairman.
Richard.
Good morning, Commissioners. This morning you're going to be asked to consider two matters. One is the emergency adoption of an ordinance. The second is going to be a discussion of a possible resolution adoption, which we're going to recommend you not take action on this morning. But with regard to the ordinance adoption, because we're doing that under emergency circumstances, I will need the board to proffer a motion to waive the regular advertising requirements, declare a state of emergency, and that immediate adoption of this ordinance is necessary. So that should be your first course of action if you would undertake that right now.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make the motion as outlined by our county attorney.
And I'll second that.
A motion by a second, Commissioner Wayne. Any public comment on that motion? We'll come back to the board. Any objection? No objection. Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with your indulgence, now we'll go into the substantive presentation of the ordinance amendment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. During last Tuesday's regular meeting, the board directed that the proposed amendments to Chapter 6 of the Land Development Code regarding flood regulations proceed through an expedited committee review process, only going to the local planning agency rather than through committees. The board also directed staff to consider an adjustment factor to the property appraiser's calculated building value as it relates to the 50% rule. The items before you this morning represents the collective work of community development staff and the county attorney's office in consultation with the Florida Department of Emergency Management's Floodplain Management Office. Dave Loveland, Community Development Director, will now present the details of the items for you, which includes two things, as Richard mentioned: the adoption of an ordinance to amend the Chapter 6 of Lee County Land Development Code, and followed by a discussion regarding the resolution to apply an adjustment factor to the property appraiser's calculated building value. Dave?
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, Commissioners. As had been indicated, this has been set up as a two-part process, and so I'm going to discuss the Land Development Code amendments to Chapter 6 of our Land Development Code, where our flood regulations are, and seek your approval on just that part of it. You know, as we went through this process, of course, we're looking to try to achieve some balance in the needs of the residents and to focus on resiliency for the future. And we needed to be cognizant of what the potential impacts of what we're doing are on our CRS rating process, which affects our flood insurance issues. A lot of this relates to the 50% rule, and just for the public's benefit, that once again is a requirement that comes from FEMA and their National Flood Insurance Program. And for buildings that are located in special flood hazard zones, when the cost of proposed improvements or repairs equals or exceeds 50% of the value of the building, then the building must be brought into full compliance with current flood damage prevention regulations, and that includes elevations. So the specific changes that we're talking about today, there were two that we had talked to you previously in June about. One was updating the reference to the FEMA flood insurance rate maps We have an older version referenced in our regulations now, so we're going to reference the new maps that take effect November 17th. There's also an amendment to the elevation requirements for manufactured homes in special flood hazard areas and coastal high hazard areas, as that is defined by FEMA. And that is to maintain consistency with the FEMA requirements in our regulations. An additional amendment is to our substantial improvement definition within Chapter 6. This is removing the reference to a cumulative determination of improvement costs over the prior 5-year period for purposes of the 50% rule calculation for all properties except repetitive loss properties. So we would be going to a permit-by-permit approach, as some other jurisdictions have done, for reviewing the cost side of the equation. For repetitive loss properties, we have a comprehensive plan policy 59.1.11 that says we are going to maintain a cumulative assessment process for repetitive loss properties, as that is defined by FEMA. That definition is any property that's had 2 or more National Flood Insurance Program losses of at least $1,000 each paid out within any 10-year period. So that particular change is a more restrictive regulation than average. We do get points for that in our CRS rating system, so we would potentially lose those points. It's 29 points total. But our scoring system, based on the last audit that was just completed in August, I believe, we had 2,797 points. So a loss of 29 puts it as 2,768, well over the threshold for Class 5 that we're in, which gets us a 25% discount on flood insurance. That threshold is 2,500 points. We're also asking, and as part of that, to reference the repetitive loss properties, since they still have to be cumulative, they would be subject to a 1-year look back of costs rather than a 5-year for those repetitive loss properties. We're also proposing some changes to the market value definition in our code. This is simply some clarification based on some model ordinance language provided by the state, so we're reflecting their changes. And there would be then some additional modifications that are outlined in the draft ordinance to some other sections where they reference back to these major changes and are no longer necessary, so that there's some strike-through and modifications in other sections. That is the package of changes to the Land Development Code that are codified in that ordinance that is attached. And then I would turn it over to Richard to discuss the valuation issue, which we had proposed as part of a separate resolution.
Mr. Chairman?
Richard?
We would respectfully suggest that you separate the issues and take action on the proposed ordinance at this time, and then reserve the discussion on the resolution until after the board has acted with regard to adoption of this amendment.
Thank you. You need a motion for that?
Yes, sir. We need a motion to adopt the ordinance amendment as presented by staff.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I will make the motion to adopt the ordinance amendment as presented by staff, but certainly want to hear public comment. But I'll make the motion for approval so that the public knows what they're commenting on.
Great, and I'll second that for
Do you
discussion.
have a second, Commissioner Wayne? Okay. Any other comments, Richard?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay. We will now call for public comment on that motion. Any public comment? We have some cards here. We have Richard Durling. Would you like to speak first? Was sure if you're going to speak on this matter or the other matter, so go ahead.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. For the record, my name is Richard Durling. I represent the Lee Building Industry Association here today, and for the most part, we would support the recommended changes to the ordinance. However, because of the 50% determination and postponing possibly the resolution today, I'd ask the question of whether or not we can actually postpone also the effective date of the implementation of the new maps on 11/17/22. Because of our inability to determine what the 50% number is really going to be, because we really don't know clearly yet what assessed value versus market value is, there's going to be some people who are going to be subject to these new maps. In some places, the increase is considerable, up to 3 feet. And there are people who are currently compliant but won't be after the 17th. So we need time to adjust to that. So I don't know whether or not you can make that adjustment at this point, but we would encourage you to do that, postpone the implementation of those new maps to some point in the future so that we can adapt to that change. You know, our real issue here today, which we're not going to obviously be able to address based on what we're hearing from the state, is this assessed value versus market value. As we've said before, we've seen increases in the cost over the last 2 years of almost 38%. So we have a lot of people that quite honestly are right there at that 50% number and being able to improve their properties, renovate their properties, repair the damage, and without having an additional percentage over the assessed value that's shown on the tax records, we're not going to be able to repair these people's properties and stay in compliance with FEMA regulations. It's a huge impact. There are thousands of houses in this community that are impacted, thousands of families that are going to be affected. So as I said at LPA yesterday, and you know, maybe this is overstating the matter, but this is a social catastrophe for this community if we have to displace thousands of families. And the choice is going to be either they repair these homes and get back with their lives, or they walk away from these houses. And it's going to be a 2008, 2010 scenario all over again here in Lee County. So I respectfully ask your consideration on these topics. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. We have another card, Paul Beatty. Paul?
I'm good. He's got me. I'm good.
Okay. Any other public comment? Please come forward if you have any public comment and state your name for the record. Just come to the podium and state your name for the record. Thank you.
Roger Horton. I'm in a community which is right off of the river. It's mainly canals. It's called Old Development, Port Edson, 41 and against the river, right across from town here. In that community, I would say that in at least 95% of the houses were flooded between 2 and 4 feet. They were houses that were built in the 60s and 70s, mainly cinder block. The issue is that whether it's market value or even tax value, at current construction repairs, contractors, subcontractors, and material cost, what it's going to cost to rebuild the houses that were insured, that have to deal with FEMA, with Lee County code, so on and so forth, it's going to be definitely more than 50%. It's a question of whether myself, and I have a couple of other people that asked the question, and that would have to go to Lee County engineer, I'm sure, and architects, whether or not they can go up and put a second story on top of the existing walls, reinforced with additional piers, a new header across, so forth like that, or whether the entire building would have to be raised. This would take it up 8 feet. Trying to take one of these buildings up 4 feet means you're going to knock the whole damn thing down. Things like the roofing materials. The code now for Lee County is plywood roof. Most of these old houses were planked or tongue and groove. According to code, if you have to repair that and the insurance company, in order to get your permit, you have to tear all the damn planking off and then plywood. So there's a lot of expenses here which are going to, regardless, as the previous comment said, is going to run way beyond what either the market or the tax is 50% of the building. And generally speaking, a lot of us are willing to do something like that. Of course, it's going to be war with the insurance company, who only wants to pay the minimum. But it's just that the costs that were reflected in your tax or market do not reflect the current cost that it's going to be either for labor, materials, contracting, or anything else. So therefore, we're looking at a lot more money to rebuild these houses, and particularly if they're raised. And that's basically the question, is that we really do need clarity because of the additional costs that it's just the current situation the way it is, and that the regulations and the current things are sort of really gray. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other public comment at this time? Please come forward if you fill a card. If you didn't fill a card out, try to fill one out and just say your name for the record, and you get 3 minutes. The lights will tell you how much time you have left.
I had not planned to speak today, but I'm Kimberly Powers from John R. Wood Properties. I'd like to address the fact that we have such an incredible community. I have families, probably 6, almost 10, that are shopping, and they're willing to invest their money. But right now, with what's happening with inflation, and they're qualified buyers, but what's happening with inflation, when we're getting quotes from the builders, they're outlandish. So when we get to that 50% mark, it's a really difficult thing. So what's going to happen to our community is we're going to sell to flippers. Our sellers are going to get pennies on the dollar. That's sad. They shouldn't, because people are willing to go in and pay for these great properties that have been wet and people are ready to leave and go to North Carolina or wherever. But we have a community that's willing and ready to rebuy. But that mark is a tight mark with the inflation that's happening right now. So that's my concern from a real estate point of view in this market. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? We'll come back to the board for discussions or any questions. Richard, do you have anything else to add?
No, sir.
Okay. Roger, do you have anything else for your staff? Have anything else to add? Mark?
Anything else to add, Mark?
Just one thing, Commissioners, it's my understanding that the adoption of the new FEMA flood map is a prerequisite of FEMA to be part of the flood insurance program. So I'm unsure delaying that date or that adoption is going to be permissible by FEMA.
That was one of my questions. So Richard, can you respond to that as far as the date? The set date for November 17th?
That was my understanding, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, if I might perhaps offer some comments beyond. It's incumbent upon your staff and certainly this board to maintain the public policy to the greatest extent possible. And here I think the public policy is advanced by ensuring our continued participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. Having said that, we certainly understand the implications of the valuation process for individuals affected by the hurricane. And I think what we're trying to do here is put the board in a position to balance those interests. And a balancing of those interests this morning, I believe, would lead to moving forward with the ordinance as proposed. And then we deal with the valuation issues certainly as a second part of this meeting, but more importantly in the future and at your next meeting. We had a bit of a curveball thrown to us this morning on the valuation issues, which we can get into in a moment. But I think Mr. Moore is entirely correct, and it's incumbent upon the board to move forward with the adoption of the ordinance as proposed.
Thank you. Well, I think it's evident that's why we're here today in the special meeting, trying to do the right thing for our community. We understand there's thousands of families been affected by this, and thousands of homes going to be affected by what this action, what from the devastating storm, but also what actions we take here, how they can recover. So, any other comments from the commission?
Just a question for clarity, Richard. So you would suggest 2 separate motions from this board, 1 to adopt the maps, and then 2 to actually have a deferral on the percentage?
Actually, Mr. Chairman, if we could, the items have been bifurcated for you already this morning, so we would respectfully request an action on the ordinance, which is the motion and the second that you have on the floor, and then with your indulgence, we can take up the question of the resolution.
Okay.
We have a motion second. We'll go ahead and call for any.
Yeah, could I just ask a couple questions real quick for clarity, Mr. Chair, if I may? Okay, so I like to pay attention to the wording of things just so that I can understand this. So I think the question that was posed during public comment, rightfully so, was could we postpone the adoption of the flood maps? If I read the way this is this is worded, it says, we would reference the newest version of FEMA's flood insurance rate maps for Lee County that take effect November 17th. So that tells me these are going to take effect November 17th, whether we reference them or not. They've already been adopted. Am I understanding that correctly? We just now need to update our references to them?
I believe we have to adopt them, and that's what we brought forward here, so that we can reference them inside of the ordinance itself.
But have they already been adopted? Because it says they take effect November 17th. So are we,
Those are when FEMA has said those maps will now become effective on the 17th. We have to adopt them.
okay, so FEMA says November 17th, those maps are effective. So we can't take an action today to make FEMA postpone that because they're the federal emergency management agency. They're setting policy for the whole nation at that point? Okay. So then obviously, yeah, it wouldn't make sense to not reference them if those are the ones that are taking effect on the 17th. Okay, so that solves that part of the motion for me then. And, I certainly agree with the comments by our county attorney that we have to balance compassion during recovery, with obviously the long-term health of our community, making sure that we can still participate in the National Flood Insurance Program going forward. So, I think what we've done to try and help ease the pain on people was we're getting rid of that 5-year look back. And I think that's a really good move on our part to do that. And so, with what I have to work with, I think this is the best decision we can make today then to go forward with this motion.
Great, thank you. So we have a motion, and we have a second. Any objections to the motion? No objection, motion carries. Okay, thank you. Next one is for discussion.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, and certainly that side of the room, feel free to weigh in at any point. But Commissioners, this portion of the meeting was going to be dedicated toward asking you to adopt a resolution pursuant to the board's discussion and direction at your last meeting. That resolution would have created a certain percentage multiplier to be utilized in damage calculations going forward. This morning, we received a writing from the Florida Department of Emergency Management Floodplain Coordinating Office that indicates this legislative body does not have the authority to adopt that multiplier. Rather, that authority and jurisdiction lies wholly within the Office of the Property Appraiser. Given this literally last-minute weigh-in by the state office, it is now our recommendation that the Board of County Commissioners take no action this morning with regard to the proposed resolution, but direct staff to work with both the Property Appraiser's Office as well as State Department of Emergency Management to get clarification on this issue, which in my humble opinion represents about a 180-degree swing in the way business was conducted in the state, not only in Lee County, but statewide. There are numerous jurisdictions that have a multiplier, not only by resolution, but in their ordinance. So if this latest pronouncement from the state is their new position, it's going to have ripple effects across the state of Florida. And unless and until we can get clarification from the state, we as your staff do not feel comfortable in asking you to move forward on the issue. Therefore, we would respectfully request you not take any further issue with regard to the resolution question this morning.
Great, thank you. Any discussion for the board regarding the new information?
So just to be clear, Mr. Chairman, so what we're looking at on the screen there is the communication we received from the Florida Department of Emergency Management Office of the Floodplain Manager this morning, and it's saying that basically the county property appraiser is the appropriate government official to determine the adjustment factors, not us, that we actually should not codify any adjustment or adopt the resolution, so.
Yes, so Richard, to clarify that, the way it reads, for the property appraiser, Matt Cole is here this morning, thank you for joining us, sets the values and adjustment values, but we do have the right to add a percentage though, correct? Or would not be able to?
Not according to this.
Up until about 8 o'clock this morning, I would have answered that in the affirmative. But given this writing, specifically paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 under we conclude the following, and for the purpose of the record, Codifying a fixed adjustment factor and a locally adopted market value is inconsistent with published FEMA guidance. The county property appraiser is the appropriate government official to determine adjustment factors, which is what we're talking about, which should be determined within the bounds of the property appraiser's authority and professional experience.
So before November 8th, this morning, before a special meeting was scheduled today, has that been current practice throughout the state of Florida? And this is a complete 180 from what they've done before in other
Absolutely.
jurisdictions?
Absolutely.
Chairman, if I may?
Yeah.
Does that mean the ones that have the multiplier possibly cannot have those multipliers even though they've adopted them?
Yes. Yeah, I hesitate to answer because I'm not practicing on behalf of those jurisdictions, but given this writing, I think it's something that's going to have to be considered by every jurisdiction that has a multiplier, either by ordinance or resolution, if this writing is the final position of the department, which is one of the issues we as your staff need to take up, and given the lateness of receipt of this writing, have not had the chance to do that this morning. But
So
will.
for those jurisdictions that already took action before today, a week ago, a month ago, 6 months ago, and people have obtained permits under that assessment, how does that change their lives then? And are they going to have to go back now and reassess their value based upon this? Or we don't know yet because we just got this a few minutes ago.
Do not know, and I would hesitate to answer that on behalf of another jurisdiction.
Okay. Commissioner Ryan?
So obviously, we have a couple of options, and I want to make sure I clarify these. So take no action whatsoever since this is a fluid situation. However, nothing would preclude us from actually having this on the agenda next week in the event something miraculously changed between today and next Tuesday. Would that be an accurate statement?
Absolutely. And
I'm much more comfortable in the second instance. I don't want to close the door completely since we do have some time, since we do have that situation, and since just 10 minutes ago you walked to my office to tell me the news. Let's be prudent. Let's wait till next week. If nothing else changes, we at least haven't made any decision. I do want to not address this item, but I still want to keep it open, or keep the glimmer of the door open this much in the event something changes, since this is a fluid situation.
And, Mr. Chairman, we will provide the board with an update regardless of how this issue resolves itself.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'd love to have any future comments from our property appraiser too, because I'm sure this was a surprise to him too, so thank you. Matt, would you like to address the board?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Board members, this was new, but I'll just give a couple of thoughts for you all to consider, and certainly I know these will be the thoughts that I expect I'll share in concert with your staff here over the next week in preparation for the next meeting. You have a problem with multiple different jurisdictions defining these values in different ways. You have a compounded issue in case law, particular to the state of Florida. In 1965, the state Supreme Court found that fair market value and just value were identical. And that is still the prevailing case law as it applies to the practice of public property appraisal. So if you were to take that on its face, that would seem to suggest that there is no room for any factor adjustment. But then it boils down to, what does fair market value mean? And does that mean the same thing as market value as intended by FEMA when they outline that? You further have case law that our office just won this last November, specific to the application of a fixed percentage. The petitioners were asking for a straight line 15% deduction to their recent sales as their assessed value for the tax roll. We oppose that as an inappropriate methodology, and we won that case. And in the 20th Circuit, the straight line application of a fixed percentage is not appropriate as a matter of case law. So having those two foundational positions informing how we develop the tax roll, I just want to remind us to be thoughtful about then potential unintended consequences of how we navigate this process in any decision we specifically might make, and a decision I might make in terms of now that it appears to be totally in my court as a point of opinion from DEM.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yep. Any more discussion with the board? Do we need to give direction as far as having on the agenda for next month, or you guys got that?
Mr. Chairman, I think we're fine
Okay,
without a motion.
okay, great. Any other discussion before we adjourn? Richard,
Public comment, Mr. Chairman?
yes, please.
Just if you would, as a matter of course, ask for any public comment regarding any of these matters raised this morning, and then we can close out.
Any public comment on this discussion? Richard?
And Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, for the record, Richard Durling. The simple response is that we're obviously opposed to that direction. I don't believe the state is sensitive to the situation we have here, and it's very easy for them to rule from Tallahassee what we need to do here in our local community to try to help the families that need it the most. You know, $13.8 million in savings because we participate in this program is a drop in the bucket compared to the cost that it's going to take this county to recover. So I know you have a difficult decision. I'm glad I'm not sitting in your seats today, but I don't know what else we can do. I mean, I guess you're really tied to do what you think is best for this county, but I know you all are considering the impact to the families here as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Kevin, good morning.
Mr. Chairman, it's Kevin Besser, Director of Public Policy for the Royal Palm Coast Realtors. I wasn't going to comment today because I don't now know what to say after we found out this ruling from the state floodplain manager, but I do want to say this. We are here to make sure that homeowners can keep their homes and have the ability to try to save their homes and save their families. You know, we are very comfortable with a 30% multiplier rule. Whenever, you know, if Matt decides that or you all decide that, that's you know, one thing or the other. I do want to say this, though. We're not talking about being kicked out of the NFIP flood program. We're talking about losing a discount rate. So yes, homeowners insurance prices would possibly go up, but we are not talking about getting kicked out of the program. I just want to make that clear. In the conversation I had with FEMA last Wednesday, you know, they didn't mention any of this. So this is surprising to say the least, but I do commend you for the work you've done today on the look back. I think that's a great start, but I would like to see a 30% multiplier. I think it's fair, I think it's safe, and I think it will make sure that homeowners have the chance to stay in their homes. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Paul Beatty, Lee BI President, owner of Beatty Development. One thing I want to touch on, obviously I support all the comments here this morning. As a remodel contractor, one of the consequences this is going to create is unlicensed, unpermitted work. These homes, these 21,000 structures, we all know they're not going to be bulldozed. If we don't do something, it's going to, before Ian, we had a problem with unpermitted and unlicensed work. And whether it be investors that end up buying these from families and flipping them, they're going to hire the chuck in the trucks. They're going to do what they need to do to build these homes and create a long-term catastrophe for our industry. These people in a lot of these homes are our tradesmen, our plumbers, our electricians, our carpenters, and we can't, as an owner and an ethical contractor, sitting there, I have several tradesmen that work for me that lost their homes to flooding and telling them I can't pull a permit, and they got kids and that go to the schools that eat here and play here in our county. It's very, very concerning. So one thing I just wanted, like you said, I wanted to mention, if we don't do something, these homes are going to be rebuilt, a majority of them. We're going to force the hand of them illegally, unpermitted, and unlicensed contracting. And as a licensed contractor, the leader of our industry association, we're pushing on a daily basis. Pre-Ian, this is a battle we fight every day, dealing with these guys that are unpermitted and unlicensed. This is going to give them a runway to do it because their owners, investors are going to be forced to do it that way. So please take that into consideration. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Please come forward. Paul Betty.
Just a quick one, Mr. Chairman. On what the gentleman just said, you can go into any neighborhood, and you will be just overrun with people that are working by the hour, contractors, contracting, but with nothing. a lot of them migrants. You can go to any particular block, you're going to see the same thing. They're going in, they're putting up drywall, they're changing things, they're repairing roofs. There are no permits pulled. And a lot of times it's the case of people that have no insurance. And so what he's talking about, it isn't just coming. It is so widespread that you couldn't walk without tripping over it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Danny?
Morning, Commissioners. Danny Ballard, President of North Fort Myers Civic. We need to do something, and I agree with what the gentleman just said, and driving all over North Fort Myers. You can go in any neighborhood you want to, and the reason that these unlicensed contractors, now licensed, people are desperate. You know, whatever it takes to get their house fixed, that's all they're after. So there is a major problem. And we are going to have a lot of vacant structures. I think that would happen even if you invoked a 50% referendum into it. People still can't afford it. So I've already told all the guys at the fire service, you better strap your boots on, boys. We're going to go back to where we was in the late 1900s, 2000, when we had a lot of vacant structures sitting around. They all end up burning. And that's where we're at. That's where we're headed. And like I said, you could do 50%, and I don't think it's going to totally fix the problem. It'll make it easier, but it ain't going to fix the problem. We had a devastation thing, and we're probably 10, 15 years before we can ever see it better than where we're at. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other public comment? Come back to the board for any other discussion before we adjourn. Any other discussions?
I still am of the belief that considering we just received this at 10 after 9 this morning, considering some of the comments that were made, this should be at least a conversation we have at the next board meeting.
Yes.
Just to understand the consequences, understand what we're doing by pausing and not doing anything, understand the implications to our flood, understand the discount, just make sure we're 100%. I mean, I think it's prudent to have the opportunity to make sure we have additional questions that may be asked. I'm not used to someone making a policy decision or recommending I make a policy decision, walk in my office at 10 after 9. That briefing is inadequate. So for nothing else, I at least want to have a conversation amongst us next Tuesday.
Mr. Chair, if I may, could I, Roger, feel free to give this to whoever on your team that you think is the best to answer it. But the question I want to ask is, so I think we've seen the damage assessment numbers of thousands of homes that were substantially damaged or had, major damage. Are we sending out determination letters right now just saying we drove by your property, we determined it to be substantially damaged, and you're now getting this letter saying that your damage has exceeded 50%? Or do we wait until the person comes in and pulls their permit for their repair work to make that determination of if it's exceeded 50%?
Mr. Chair?
Roger.
Thank you. Mark?
Good question, Commissioner. We are not sending any messages or letters out to our constituents. It'd be really hard for us to determine whether or not they've crossed the 50% threshold. They would probably need a licensed contractor to go in and take a look at the damage in their home and put together a detailed estimate in order to determine that. So we have not issued any type of notification to homeowners.
So
I'm sorry.
I apologize for interrupting. So in Lee County, Florida, you shouldn't just assume that your home has received more than 50% damage. You should wait until your contractor values the repair work and then pulls that permit, and then we see what that permit, how that permit compares to the value.
Yes, Commissioner, that would be our recommendation, that our constituents engage with a licensed contractor to do that estimate and bring that estimate along with them when they come to apply for a permit.
Are there things in that estimate that don't necessarily have to be included in that value of the work? So for instance, if I just wanted to change out the tile in my house, I don't have to get a permit for that.
That is correct.
So when I'm doing the repair work on a house that's been flooded, do I need to put the value of the flooring in that permit value?
No, and other things including paint, no. As long as you're making the structure habitable, That's what we want to put in that estimate.
Can't you do a lot of drywall for, I mean, I'm just trying to help understand how we can help people get to where they need to be to get their homes repaired. I feel like if you're putting the value as a contractor on the permit that is just the things that require a permit, then I think it's got to be pretty hard to get to that 50%. Now I say that as somebody who's not in the business myself, but there's a lot of drywall. I mean, you can do for a couple $100,000, right? I mean, you guys are building homes for probably over 200 a square foot now, but I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, sorry, Mr. Chairman, I apologize, but yeah. So I'm just trying to help understand the process. So if obviously, if you're worried about your damage being more than 50% of the value of your structure, and you're in that special flood hazard zone, that's when you hire your contractor, you get the scope of work figured out, and you turn in your permit with that correct value on it, and then we get the determination. And then if it's still above the 50%, you have that option at that point to hire a private appraiser as well. So there are still, I'm just trying to help get this out there in case FEMA and this letter ties our hands. These are some options that people could look at and think about, so.
You are correct.
All right, thank you.
I'm glad you brought that because I think what's happening, a lot of people look at their total loss, flooring, appliances, furniture, clothing, drywall, electrical, wiring, if it was salt intrusion. So I think what we need to focus on what the permits are actually going to be. And I know Commissioner Greenwell knows more about this than any of us does as far as you're actually replacing 4 feet of drywall, studs. Are you replacing electrical, not fresh water, salt water? But the appliance, I think some people are thinking the appliances, their home goods, the flooring was part of that equation. I think once you separate that, it is going to be hopefully less than what it is, unless they have some structural damage to them. If it's a wood house or anything, we had mold now, that's going to be, the cleanup is going to be more, so. Okay.
Chairman, if I may. I think, I don't even know if I'm allowed to say this, but I'm going to say it. I think everyone should realize that we are part of this community too, and we feel the pain just like everybody's feeling the pain. We're going to try to do the best we can legally to make the right decision for this county to move forward. We'd like to make that decision today, but unfortunately we can't. So I just want it to be on the record out there to know that we were blindsided this morning a little bit, and we're going to dig in and try to find out what we can do legally and what we can't. But I can pretty much guarantee you this board's going to do everything it can to try to serve our community the best we can. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands that we're not making a decision because our hands are tied. So we really have no choice today. So.
Thank you. Okay, we'll look forward to talking about it next week. And we'll be adjourning now, and after adjournment, in 10 minutes, we're going to have a press conference across the hallway regarding tropical storm Nicole. Yes, Roger.
Mr. Chair, before we leave, if you indulge me just a moment, please, I'd like to give you a little bit of good news.
Yes.
I was in a bar over the weekend, which will come as no surprise to a lot of people, but we were watching a football game. And my wife Vivian ended up in conversation with a couple that we had never met before. Turns out they were from Chicago, moved here a few years ago, and had substantial damage to their home from the hurricane. And they relayed to me that how easy and how good their experience was in dealing with our permitting office, building permits. Remember we set up that operation in Admin East for a while following the storm, and the goal was to provide permits on the spot, all those permits that people applied for that we were capable of issuing immediately. And they went on to, rave about the kind of service that they received from your employees. I just want to pass that along because we don't always hear that. And so I just want to say congratulations to Department of Community Development and the permitting staff. They've been doing just a great job in all of this.
Yeah, we hear the stories all the time, but not enough of them. But thank you, because people, when they're happy, they don't complain about it. So that's a bad thing. So thank you to all your staff for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, we'll be adjourned.